headbanging to Bach. Hello, YouTube! Welcome to the Baroque. I unfortunately don't own a gown that looks Baroque, but since the Baroque was classified by its ostentatious and gaudy style, I kind of figured that I could just look gaudy, and it would kind of work. The Baroque followed the Renaissance period and started around 1600 and lasted until around 1750. As I mentioned last week, the intense adoration of ancient Greek philosophy and music led to the start of the Renaissance and also the end of the Renaissance. Basically, ancient Greek philosophers and authors wrote that their music was mainly one melody and accompaniment on a stringed instrument. Unfortunately, that didn't fit into the polyphonic musical style of the Renaissance. Polyphony did manage to survive, but it changed quite a bit. Most music began to be homophonic instead of polyphonic. Homophonic music is essentially one line and accompaniment in a chordal style. So, melody, accompaniment. Polyphonic music was a bunch of different melodies, so melody, melody, and they would just kind of weave around each other. So let's start with the early Baroque period. This spans the transitional period from 1580 till 1630. The big guys of the early Baroque were known as the Florentine Camerata. They were essentially a club of composers, poets, humanists, and intellectuals in Florence, Italy. Their job was to form new trends in the arts based on ancient Greek values. One of the ways they did this was by romanticizing the ancient Greek tradition of having one singer perform an entire epic, accompanying him or herself on a chitarra, which is essentially a two-stringed lyre. This led to the development of opera! The first operas were by a guy named Jacopo Peri, and he wrote operas based on the stories of Daphne and Eurydice, which are two very, very famous Greek myths. The other power player of the early Baroque was a guy named Claudio Monteverdi. He also composed operas, but what he's most known for amongst musicologists, such as ourselves, is his music theory work. He solidified the difference between the Renaissance and Baroque styles by creating terms called prima pratica and seconda pratica. Prima pratica, or first practice, refers to the Renaissance style of polyphonic music. Seconda pratica, or second practice, refers to the Baroque style of music, which uses melody and accompaniment, or homophony. There's even a term for this accompaniment called basso continuo, which means continuous bass. So far, we've been listening to some of Monteverdi's opera, L'Incarnazione d'Epopeia, which is actually the first opera I ever saw, and made me fall in love with classical music. The Middle Baroque, which goes from 1630 to around 1680, basically saw a spread of the seconda pratica throughout Europe. This period saw a flowering of such genres as opera, a theatrical and musical setting of a dramatic text sung by characters and accompanied by a musical ensemble. Oratorio, pretty much the same thing as an opera, except it's about a religious topic, and it's not usually performed with costumes in a setting. Cantata, basically just a short oratorio, and it's usually religious, but sometimes it's allegorical with characters like virtue and valor. And concerto grosso, an instrumental work with a relatively large orchestra. These pieces would alternate between using the entire ensemble and using only small sections of the ensemble. Big names of the middle period include Jean-Baptiste, who worked for King Louis XIV of France, the guy who invented ballet. Henry Purcell, an English guy who wrote about 800 pieces during his 36-year lifetime. And Dietrich Buxtehude, a church organist in Lübeck, Germany. We're currently listening to Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas, which I actually performed my senior year of high school. Oh, the memories. The late Baroque, which spans from 1680 to 1750, is where tonality as we know it really solidified itself. Composition teachers of this time began to teach both homophony and polyphony as important tools to use together. This led to the style of the most famous composer of the Baroque period, Johann Sebastian Bach. He was unfortunately not famous during his lifetime, and it wasn't until many, many years after his death that people began to realize how amazing his music was. Bach wrote an absurd amount of music. 1,126 pieces still survive today. And we know that he wrote even more music, but he just churned it out so fast that there wasn't much they could do with it. I heard one story that his wife would actually wrap gifts to friends in compositions he wrote. What? And these weren't just little ditties. Some of these pieces were massive in scale, and some pieces lasted over 5 hours. We are currently listening to the Kyrie from his B minor Mass. The other thing to become fully established during the late Baroque was opera. Opera became extremely formulaic, and those formulas still exist to some extent today. Operas began to be made up of arias and recitatives. Arias are the catchy songs that are melodic and accompanied by a full orchestra, whereas recitatives are the speech-like dialogues between characters. These recitatives are usually only accompanied by one or two instruments. During the late Baroque, arias were composed such that there were sections, so there was one section, a second section, and then the first section would repeat again. And during this repeat, the singers would ornament the crap out of this music. This was basically just a way for them to show off how talented they were at singing. The most famous composer of opera and vocal works during the late Baroque was Georg Friedrich Händel, a German dude who studied in Italy and then spent most of his life composing in England. And actually he became a naturalized English citizen, so he changed his name to George Friedrich Händel. He was so English, in fact, that one of his compositions is still played at the coronation of every English monarch to this day. That's what we are currently listening to. It is called Zadok the Priest. Side note, I love the TV show The Borgias, and usually they do a really good job of keeping music in the Renaissance period. But in that opening scene in the first episode where Daddy Borgia has just been crowned the Pope and he's being paraded through the streets, they play that piece. And it wasn't written until like 200 years after the Borgia Pope. These are the things that upset me. All gaudy things must eventually settle down and become more accessible if they're going to survive. This is what happened to Baroque music. The flowering ornaments and dense textures eventually gave way to the next period of music, classical music. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Baroque. As with last week's video, I'm putting a guided listening list in the description below, and the pieces that are my favorite I'm marking with a huge love. We are now over halfway done with our brief guide to music history. Next week's video may be a little late. I'm gonna try and get it in by Tuesday, but I'm heading off to Germany, so I'm not really sure what the video situation's gonna be like, but I'll let you guys know. I'll keep you updated on the Facebook page. Musicology.